Welcome to Fun in Key West, where every day feels like a mini fest. Grab a drink, take it slow. We'll show you where the locals go. Food, fun, and stories to tell. Hidden gems you know so well. Your Key West experts here to say it's fun in Key West every day.
Welcome to another episode of Historic Marker Monday. I am so glad that you are here. If you are joining me live, please let me know you're here. As you can see, I am in Florida again. And so we are going to be talking all about the historic markers today, like we do every Monday. And today is an interesting conversation because it's all about not necessarily a place, but an event that occurred during the Civil War, which is Key West dealt with the epidemic of yellow fever. If you go to, there's a place over on White Street. It's 625 White Street. You're going to go there and you're going to walk by it and you're not even going to know what it is. But this place is green grass. It has white fencing around it. It's in a quiet part of Key West and the island. But it represents a time during the island where there was a lot of fear. There was sickness, that people were burning their stuff because they just didn't know where the sickness came from. And a lot of people then were buried in this field at 625 White. And this is an unmarked cemetery. But if you walk by, I want you to understand what it is, the significance, and then let's talk about what occurred in Key West and Fort Jefferson about this time with yellow fever and dengue fever. If you're watching me live, please say hi so I can do a shout out. The yellow fever and the way Key West and the military dealt with, yellow fever and dengue fever wasn't necessarily about how they dealt with the disease. It was more about the resilience of the people in Key West, and we talk about that all the time. You're going to see a lot of resilience and how scrappy Key West people are. But you're going to be on White Street and you're going to be between Angela and Southern. And this was originally an army cemetery during the Civil War. And here you're going to have burials of soldiers, civilians, women, and children were actually buried around the edges. The critical point was most people during the Civil War did not die in combat. They died from disease. And so disease was the true enemy of people during this time. So you were more likely to die from disease than from a gunshot during the Civil War. But you had two twin terrors, if you want to look at it from that perspective. You had yellow fever and you had dengue fever. Yellow fever was also known as yellow jack. It produced high fever, jaundice, which meant you turned yellow, and your eyes were yellow, your skin turned yellow. You had internal bleeding if you ended up with a severe case, and it was often fatal within days. Dengue was also known as breakbone fever. You had intense joint and muscle pain. It was debilitating, but usually not fatal. The thing about it is it spread fast through Key West, and Mr. Coffee's saying hello. And why did it spread fast? Well, you had the tropical climate, and so it just produced an environment that all this transmitted easily. Standing water. And we know that whenever hurricanes come through and you have any type of natural disaster, standing water is always the bad thing to happen. And you had constant ship traffic that came in from the Caribbean. What people thought caused yellow fever back then wasn't necessarily true. What actually caused it was mosquitoes spread it. But that was not yet suspected during this time. Most popular theories of the time included bad air, vapors from rotting organic matter, cemeteries themselves being dangerous. And what happened was you created a environment of people who burned clothing, they burned bedding, and they burned furniture, thinking if we burn everything that that person touched or was associated with, then we're not going to have any chance of catching that fever. They abandoned their homes. They avoided being around the sick people entirely. And sometimes what happened was families were actually destroyed because people just didn't come and support each other. In stepped a radical idea of the time, which was quarantining. So the military and the people of Key West decided, you know what, let's keep those ships off of our shores. Let's keep them out at the water. Homes of sick people were sealed off so that the people weren't coming in and out. If a city was rampant with yellow fever or dengue fever, then they cut it off from trade, which, there was probably better ways to do that. And military installations were repeatedly shut down. In the 1820s, the naval station and the army barracks in Key West were closed due to a lot of these outbreaks. In steps Joseph Yates Porter. Now, Porter is a very common name in Key West, and you're going to know why here in a minute. But if you're standing on the corner there looking at the Bull and Whistle, across the street, you're going to see a greenhouse. That is Dr. Porter's house. He was actually born in that house and he died in that house. And that's another whole story we can get into, and his daughter Jessie Porter and how she helped with the revitalization and the historic preservation of a lot of these places in Key West. But Dr. Porter steps in during this outbreak. And he is a Key West doctor who strongly supports quarantine measures. And his insistence on isolation helped reduce and slow down the outbreaks of yellow fever. Even though at this point in time, the cause of yellow fever is still unknown, his method worked. And his method laid the groundwork then for modern public health responses to outbreaks. As you walk by the cemetery there over on White Street, you're going to ask, why are there no headstones? Well, back then, that was cost cutting by the government. Women and children were never marked with stones back then. And then there was a later decision to relocate the soldiers, and they were then, their remains were shipped to Pensacola. And then, believe it or not, there was record keeping errors, and many graves were lost and their identities were lost. So there were some soldiers who were buried twice, and others just disappeared from history. So sad to have, survived a war, but then turned around and, you're lost and can't be found because of paperwork. Another connection to yellow fever and Key West is Fort Jefferson. When you take that trip out to Fort Jefferson and you go out to the Dry Tortugas, this is, obviously a very remote island fort, and it's surrounded by water, and so it lacked a lot of fresh resources. And this was the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. In the 1860s, that outbreak of yellow fever, they devastated the soldiers there, the prisoners there, and the laborers there that were working on the fort. It was actually more feared, yellow fever was, than the punishment and the imprisonment there at Fort Jefferson. And what they ended up doing is the areas around Fort Jefferson, there are small islands, and they put up small hospitals and they built them on those nearby islands. And when an individual became sick at Fort Jefferson, they were then moved to one of these island hospitals. Obviously, the isolation helped reduce the spread of the disease. Now, what's interesting is, and if you start going into a deep dive on this and really start to go down that rabbit hole of history, they are now uncovering underwater remains of quarantine facilities and submerged cemeteries around the waters of Fort Jefferson. It's fascinating to see what they're discovering and what they're finding. I found a lot of interesting articles over on Smithsonian.com. The Dry Tortugas Park website has some information there too. So if you want to go into that deep dive, do it. And let me know, what do you find out? Did you learn something new that you didn't know about? what's interesting as I start to do a lot of this research and looking at a lot of these historic markers, there's a lot of history that connects Key West to other events around the world or even into American history. So you've got maritime history and American history, and Key West really played a pivotal part in a lot of the history that occurred. So I'm going to test your middle school history here. In steps Dr. Samuel Mudd, who was the doctor who helped John Wilkes Booth, who shot and assassinated President Lincoln. He is sentenced because of his service to, because of him rendering medical assistance to Booth. He is then convicted and serves his time out at Fort Jefferson. And during the 1867 yellow fever outbreak, he is actively treating the sick. He is putting himself in harm's way of contracting the disease, but he's out doing what he believed to be right. And his actions actually saved a lot of lives there at Fort Jefferson. And what ended up happening is his medical services and the efforts that he gave to those that were at Fort Jefferson during this time actually led to his eventual pardon. So that when you start looking back in history as to him being pardoned, a lot of what he did in his service, in his medical service at Fort Jefferson, led to that. So, why did yellow fever change everything? If you think about it, it forced cities to rethink sanitation. How do we make sure there isn't a bunch of standing water? How do we make sure the areas are cleaned up and there aren't mosquitoes and there aren't the things that attract disease around? So, you're going to see that after this, a lot of cities started to invoke policies that helped with that sanitation. It proved that quarantining does stop the spread of disease. You know, like when you have a cold or you have the flu, you stay home, you don't go to work, and you hopefully don't spread that to anybody else. It helped push medical research forward into trying to figure out where do these diseases come from, how are they transmitted, and how do we stop them. And eventually, back in the 1900s, then it led to the ability for people to then track that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes. And it also changed how militaries operate in tropical regions and hopefully helped to stop any further spread of that. So, as you walk by this mile marker over on White Street, you're just it's gonna be like an empty field full of green grass, and you've got that white fence around it. And the impact of what that stood for and what happened in Key West, the surrounding islands, the Florida Keys, Fort Jefferson, all of that during this time period where they were fearful of yellow fever and dengue fever. It talks about how resilient Key West is and the measures that they took to protect their people. So, you never know what story you're going to hear or learn as you walk by these markers. It's amazing that, like I said, the history that keeps connecting Key West back to all of this maritime, military, and American history. So as you're walking around Key West, be sure to take a moment when you walk by one of these historic markers and read them, and then and appreciate the story that and the people that it highlights. Again, sometimes these highlight a building, sometimes they highlight a person, sometimes they highlight an event. But it's so interesting, all of this connection. There's over 120 of them in Key West, so I challenge you to go find them all. But if you need help, be sure to head over to FunInKeyWest.com. We have under What to Do a historic walking tour. It's all self-guided, and you can learn more about what's happening at each of these historic markers. While you're over there, sign up for our book club and sign up for our happy hour list, because that gets you on your newsletter. And guess what happens when you're on the newsletter? You get a newsletter every week that has a trivia question in it. And if you get that trivia question right, then you get to be in a drawing for a fun and an exciting Key West swag box every month. Well, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Historic Marker Monday. And I am always so glad that you're here and you're part of our community. And be sure to check out all of our other videos over on YouTube and drop me a line. Say, hey, you know what? I've walked by that spot and didn't realize what it was. Or if you have some other information that you think I would find very interesting, drop me a line. Say, hey, Michelle, check this out. In the meantime, you guys have a great day. Thank you so much for stopping by, and we'll talk to you later.